Good evening and shalom. Blessings to you all. Welcome to this episode of the Watchdog. We are having a pretty awesome interview today. Going to be with one Adam Kokesh, Libertarian presidential party candidate, actually. So excuse the noise here. Just getting a Skype call. I got an answer. Hello, Mr. Kokesh.
Hello.
You hear me all right?
I was in and out for a second there, but now it's good.
All right, I'm good on my end. Can you hear me now?
The connection seems there's a bad lag on the audio. There's poor connection. I don't know if that means it's on your end or it's on my end. I'm just using my phone, which is generally pretty reliable, and I got 4G right now, so it should be okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly fine at the moment. It says that I have the connection to the internet here at the library. I don't actually have my actual internet set up at the moment, which is why I had to be down here, unfortunately. But it says it's got 3 bars out of the 4, so I think it's good.
All right, let's say it seems to be not lagging now.
All right, awesome. Well, so thank you very much for coming on to the program here. It's certainly awesome to have somebody, of any caliber higher than us at all, let alone, somebody as high caliber as you. So I certainly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do this.
I don't know if I accept your caliber of person paradigm, but I appreciate the flattery. Thank you.
Well, so I want to ask a few questions very briefly before we continue. So first off, I just wanted to point out a few things for the audience here, just so we're perfectly clear. I know this is kind of a ridiculous thing to have to say, but you have to say it in the modern day. Neither party here is responsible for anything but the things that they themselves have said. Obviously don't want this to be overly confrontational, but just so anybody in the comments section doesn't get the wrong idea. You know what I mean? So I think first things first, I just kind of want to get some general questions about your campaign. What was the motivation to say that you wanted to run for president?
Well, I don't want to run for president, and I know that sounds cliche, but as you'll hear from the story, I'll do my best to sum it up for you. You'll see that is kind of uniquely legitimate in my case compared to any other presidential candidate who's tried to pass that fluff as legitimate. But right. It started for me way back in 2012, and it was a conversation I had with Jason Burmis, the original info warrior at Bilderberg in Virginia. And I was just there covering it and, hanging out with Alex Jones a little bit. And it was a good time. And we were debating statism versus freedom. And at some point he said, well, what would you do if you were president, or something to that effect? And I'm very much simplifying the conversation, of course. And I was like, if I was president, what do you mean, what would I do? I would quit, go home, and get a real job. And then he goes, well, no, what would you really do if you were president? And I had a moment like, well, what would I do? But then I realized that what we're talking about is very aptly covered by the story of Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and the idea of the Ring of Power. And it's like, no. What are you supposed to do when someone gives you the ring? You don't put it on. You throw it in the fire. And I said I would get rid of as much as I possibly could. And he said, well, what would you really do? And he started challenging me, and it was a great conversation, and we're still friends now. And he really was the impetus for this. What got me started thinking this way, because he started asking questions. Well, specifically, what would you do about this? What would you do about that? And I realized that the answers weren't difficult for any of them, and to really satisfy that premise of throwing the ring in the fire. And so what this has developed into over the years is the idea of localizing the federal government completely down to the state level, getting rid of the just completely illegitimate, destructive part, the legitimate things, the services that it provides, at least getting them down to state level control where they're more in line with the needs of the people. And when people say that I'm a presidential candidate, a part of me dies inside because I'm really not. It's true that I'm technically running for president, but it's more accurate to say that I'm using my candidacy to turn the election into a referendum on whether or not the federal government should be allowed to exist at all, and whether or not we're just better off without it. And if we decide that we're better off without it, how do we have a peaceful transition away from this centralized power structure right now? And so what I'm suggesting is a peaceful, orderly, responsible process of localization that leaves us with 50 independent states and up to 562 sovereign native nations. And I am resigning on day one. We essentially declare the federal government bankrupt and of no authority. So federal laws are no longer enforceable. It becomes a custodial institution. I immediately resign. I mean, the idea would be that if I'm president, it's a purely ceremonial, thing to swear in that day and then go sign, one executive order, pile of executive orders. But basically, as soon as I sign that, I resign from the presidency to become. I think the appropriate title would be custodian of the federal government, and that's what we're doing with this campaign. It's been really exciting to see how many people are going, yeah, this might be an idea whose time has come, and if we are so lucky to get the Libertarian nomination with this platform, I'm very confident that we can plant the flag on this idea in 2020. We can break 10%, have a breakout year for the LP, and if this is an idea whose time has come, I think we could find out as soon as 2024.
All right. And so with that, I think there are a few questions that immediately come to mind. First one that I think would be most on my audience's mind would be, what is your personal view of the United States Constitution?
I think it represented a great step forward, or I should say, part of the great step forward that was the founding of this country, that was the establishment of independence from Great Britain. But actually, I think the Constitution represents a step backwards in that process. That and I make an important distinction, to me at least, between the founders and the framers. And the founders are the ones who signed the Declaration. The founders are the ones who put their lives on the line. The founders are the ones who organized and funded and spread the ideas of the revolution, of those core ideas that to me really the Articles of Confederation prior to the Constitution, which was a more decentralized model. I would have said we were better off, and the creation of a Constitution was a step backwards from that. And one of the unfortunate consequences of that is that it created this psychological trap almost that we all fall into, where we have a hard time separating what is America, the people, the country, the government, and realizing that the government has become an anti-American institution in so many ways. And it's really hard to make the case that at least at the federal level, we'd be better off without it.
So it is interesting. There's a lot we agree on, and you actually just touched on some of the issues that we disagree on, but I do want to save those a little bit for a little bit later, just because there's a few more questions I wanted to ask in regards to just some kind of current situations. If we localize the government, then of course you'd still have issues like police brutality, issues like corruption in city councils and things like that, which have actually arguably been equal to the amount of problems caused by the federal government at this point. In your view, is there anything that can be done collectively for us to try and reduce that, or does each individual state maybe have to do it on their own, or how would you feel about that?
Well, I mean, I think we're really on the same page, wanting to transition from a government, public safety justice system to one that's more either market or militia based or at least community based. And I don't think there is one silver bullet. There's no panacea. I mean, if I was trying to pander to you, I would say, well, hey, the federal government, militarizes police forces with a lot of the ways the money comes in and goes through defense contractors. And the legal structure established by the federal government creates ways in which that it makes it more difficult to customize the public safety and accountability, the legitimate justice services to meet the needs of a community. Instead, they meet the needs of the corrupt sponsors of the federal government. So it's certainly not that it would be the be all end all, but it also creates the direction that I do think gets us all the way there. And that's really important, because if I said that police brutality was the one issue and I wanted to be president to take over and impose my vision and set police policy all over America,
right,
I would be entrenching the problem of centralized control, which means that we're affirming the idea, the corrupt idea of a bad democracy that's not voluntary, because the majority can force its will on the minority somehow. And I don't believe that that's ethical. I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't try to do that. I wouldn't even claim to have the authority to do that. But what I'm saying is that at least we can take this first step. And the direction is that if we can say as a country, hey, we're ready to lead the world forward in freedom again, as we did during the revolution, we're ready to say we don't need this centralized authority. We can have autonomous communities. We don't have to be united under one government to be united in American values. It's going to be a race down to see some states are going to get autonomy and say, we're really comfortable with this. We can get our state government so under control that it's insignificant in our lives. We don't really care. It's not worth bothering to go any further. But in most states, it's going to be like, all right, let's get down to the county level. And then at the county level, you're going to see, I think, cities break off as autonomous units, and you're going to have counties develop or communities develop within those county spaces. You're going to be able to see new communities created, setting their own rules, their own laws. And this is why this is the everybody gets what they want strategy. I think that's the real beauty of this that has the potential to unite us.
So I guess there'd be might as well just go into some of the questions, I think, on the minarchy versus anarchy sort of questions. I think that's probably, would it be, first off, just to make sure I'm on the right track with you here, would you say it's safe to assume that has become a very divisive question in the libertarian community these days? Not necessarily in the sense that people are fighting over it, but in the sense that it's like we're deciding where the Libertarian Party is going to go from this point.
Sure. Well, if you don't mind, we have an hour. I'll give you the long, politically incorrect, thoughtful answer. It's going to take me about 5 minutes here.
All right.
And I think it goes back to two factors as to how historical developments as to how we got to this point. And I'll say straight, right off the bat, it's a bullshit divide. It's primarily a semantic division, and it's one that is really unnecessarily stoked by people who want to keep libertarians divided for various reasons. So this goes back to the core idea of what is libertarianism: belief in freedom, belief in self-ownership, belief in the non-aggression principle. The Libertarian Party itself says when you join the party, the one requirement, you check a box on your form that says, I oppose the initiation of force to achieve political or social goals. That's just, whatever I believe in, I'm not going to force it on anybody else. And the Libertarian Party, semantically in its platform, we take, kind of an agnostic stance on this. And it says, government where it should, I forget the exact word, but should government exist, it must be voluntary, essentially. And so this is where the first historical event in my narrative comes in, and that's Murray Rothbard, who really is the intellectual godfather of libertarianism. When he coined the term anarcho-capitalist, he really took the two worst possible terms to describe what he was talking about and combined them into one term guaranteed to offend everyone. And part of it is that what we're talking about, it's anarchist in the truest sense of the word of no rulers, but it's not necessarily no government. If we say, like, you can have student body government, if you want a community government that's voluntary, if you have a commune where people choose to opt in and you're not forcing your rules on anybody else, we're cool with that. So I don't think, like, I'm a voluntarist. I think the ideal that all human relations should be free of force, fraud, and coercion, that they should be voluntary. I don't care if you have a thing or a group of people or an institution, organization that you call government, as long as it's voluntary. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. It's a semantic thing. But when we look at what government is today, it's clearly, well, when we talk about the sovereign entities that cover the globe called government, they are coercive monopolies, territorial coercive monopolies on violence or the initiation of force. And so when you look at that, you go, this is unethical. Now, not everything it does is unethical, but its premise is unethical. So, again, anarcho-capitalist. We're not really anarchists in the sense of no government. Just if you're going to have government, it has to be voluntary. So you could say that's anarchist because there's no rulers, but now it's semantic and it's not in line with the way that anarchy has been used in the past, right? Mm-hmm. But a lot of people respond to that when, you know, as libertarians, we all, or as just people waking up to just how screwed we all get on an ongoing basis by the current power structure. You know, we go through an angry reactionary phase, and for a while, to me, it was like, well, Murray Rothbard calls himself an anarcho-capitalist, I'll do that. But I think what I was missing is this deeper point that, like, the word capitalism, for example, even the word capitalist, like, and I believe in that. I believe in the ideal of capitalism, of self-ownership and free trade and ownership of property, the definition, an economic system based on ownership of the means of production. My body, my mind being the ultimate means of production, your mind, your body being your ultimate means of production that you own absolutely. But in a sense, that's a conclusion, just like anarchist is a conclusion. I don't have a problem with a bunch of socialists getting together on private property and coming together voluntarily and creating a community where they say our economic system is socialist. I could, you know, twist semantics and go, no, because it's voluntary, it's capitalist, but I don't care to play those games. So the term anarcho-capitalist came in, and I think it's not even accurately describing what it's trying to describe. With all due respect to Murray Rothbard, I think the term voluntarist is much more effective, or simply libertarian. And this is where what I've found is that all libertarians unite on, is that we all want to check that box. We all want to say, yeah, we don't want to force our views on anybody. And it's really kind of sad, although it's kind of understandable that of all the ways that our political enemies, if you will, I shouldn't say enemies. We don't have any enemies in the Libertarian Party. We just have people who haven't learned to be our friends yet. And I think there's a different attitude that way with the LP, but we all are united in this respect for individual human rights, the right to self-ownership, and the ideal of voluntary relations. We have different ways about how to get there, and there are different ways that you could divide libertarians that might be more precise versus, anarchists versus minarchists. I hear a lot of people who identify as minarchists say, well, I believe in the anarchist ideal, but I don't think we can get there. And it's like, well, then you're an anarchist. You're just a really anarchist. Like, and so there are people who describe themselves as moderate libertarians or pragmatic libertarians. Into this, I
think
I'm a leftist libertarian strategy. There are people who are very moderate who say, let's just scale it back, bit by bit. There are people who are sort of constitutionalist libertarians who say, I believe in this libertarian ideal and the Constitution is, yes, coercive, but let's use that as a guide stone to get it back to some libertarian ideal or to pave the way. And then there are some who are the absolutists, just get rid of it all at once. And I think what I've done with the book Freedom, which I started writing, it wouldn't be an Adam Kokesh interview if I didn't plug what I'm wearing with what's behind me with the book that is Freedom. But you can get this for free in every digital format possible, including audiobook at thefreedomline.com. So this is where I first articulated the idea of localization. Not that it's original, it's stuff I've got from lots of different sources, and bringing that to life as a possibility with this presidential campaign. I think that again has it's kind of it's not. I don't want to say it's a new idea. There are no new ideas under the sun, but I think what I'm doing with it is at least a significantly new application of this idea that really has the potential to unite, like I said, not just liberals and conservatives, who want their government experience to be more in line with their values, but it really makes all of these sort of insignificant libertarian divisions irrelevant.
So I do want to kind of, so one of the people I supported very strongly actually in the 2020 midterms is actually the Nevada gubernatorial candidate, Ryan Bundy. And he said actually what I think should be a famous quote, but it's not, every state should be its own sovereign, which I greatly believe. But it does seem to me that to a certain extent that was what the intention of the Constitution was in the first place, with the exception being that we come together for reasons of military and that you can't tell Idaho or that Idaho can't tell California that they're not allowed to trade with each other, kind of thing.
Yes, those are the excuses, right? It's just this. We're just going to, just the military, just taxes, just intellectual property, just slavery, just interstate commerce, just international relations, just protecting your rights, just a few little things. We promise we won't get into anything else.
Well, and to a certain extent, I do think, obviously, there was the idea that you wanted to hold it back to a minimum as to the smallest extent possible. But I think, and it's specifically, I think one of the big ones, there's three that I think are the biggest. I know the roads is the meme, but roads, I think we've proven we can get roads done with the private sector, no problem. The big ones to me, and I think the big ones to say, the majority of other people who would say they are monarchists or really constitutionalists, to be a better term, is how do we defend ourselves from people like Russia, from people like China, from people who at some point will want us dead, right? We know that. The part of the reason that some of the people on the conservative side like Trump, which I am not actually one of those people, just to point out, but part of the reason that they liked him is I'm not going to let you violate our national sovereignty kind of thing. So if you just, in a hypothetical world, right, you have somebody like I don't want to badmouth any current leaders just because I think there's a lot of misinformation about them, but like an Adolf Hitler, right? He wants to come into your land and forget the Holocaust and all that, just the invasion portion. How does a society, in your view, defend against that?
Well, this is where I think we can turn back to the wisdom of the founders, and they advocated against having anything like a standing army because they had already in the 1700s, from their experiences in Europe, seen that when you trust monarchs with standing armies, that they are abused. And that's always been the case. But they also knew from their experience in the Revolutionary War that a ragtag militia could defeat the greatest empire in the world. And I think if we apply those lessons consistently today, the more that we localize government, make it a defense-based one, the more we have something that's in line with the founders' vision that the best defense is a well-armed population that refuses to be governed by anyone, that will not submit to anyone else's rule, that would be ungovernable, that would say, you can come into this area if you want, but if you try to send a tax man on my door, he's going to get shot in the face, just like the last guy who tried to do that. And I know that's taking it to the extreme, and I don't think that would be necessary. But also the world that we live in today, I think that if anything, the United States military, both for its domestic and its foreign actions, has proven to be one of the most dangerous and the least trustworthy in the world. And I say this from my experience in the Marine Corps, as well as even just a casual, honest reading of history. But what other government has dropped nuclear weapons on actual cities full of civilians who, at a time when all of the military officers in the Pacific said it was unnecessary to end the war, that it was done for a host of corrupt political reasons. Like that's the consequence of trusting the government with defense, is that people will die unnecessarily. If a country is coming to invade, you want to send your best and brightest in a line and have them meet up and make it really easy for the death toll to skyrocket? No, let the invaders come in. Let them die being shot in the back if that's the case. There's so many better ways of doing this than with a government that are more effective, more efficient, more just. The founders were right. Simple as that.
And then, so then the second portion of the I think majority, like the main questions. I don't know why I said majority. It doesn't fit. The main questions that would be asked is things like trade. So, there's the obvious example of, say, the state of California doesn't like the state of Idaho for various reasons. I mean, we have huge cultural demographic differences, right? Almost to the point of where, you hear people talk around here in Idaho and you almost wonder if they're talking about their own countrymen. You know what I mean? And I'm sure it's the same in California as well. So you imagine there could be a situation where California maybe doesn't want to send avocados or something up here, and maybe Idaho doesn't in return want to send its potato product, which is 90-something% of the entire country, and then you have famines and such like that because people aren't trading with California. How do you think we would best be able to get rid of something like that, where we just have so many bickering egos on the continent that it doesn't seem we can actually have commerce the way that we did in the past?
Well, I mean, you didn't make that a simple question, and if I may address a couple of premises that I'd like to test first, if you don't mind, and maybe help me get back to the question, because I want to respond to, the idea of just, first of all, Americans. I'll just jump in. That Americans see themselves as identifying with the state versus as Americans. I still think there's something way more important that we all identify as American. And that while we've come to kind of a very sad, awkward state of affairs, if you look at where we are with freedom in America today, I've done 5 or 6, depending on how you want to count them, like legit national tours, going through every state in the lower 48 multiple times, and there is something unique about this, and I'll throw out something that I think might rub some people the wrong way here, but I think if you look at people who are in this country illegally, according to the United States government, they have committed a form of civil disobedience, asserting their freedom of movement, saying that laws don't apply to them. The United States federal government can't claim to own all this land. I think in a lot of ways they should be reminding us of what it means to be American, of standing up to unjust authority. And I disagree with your assertion that there's that inclination to argument because of the economic incentives. So there are a lot of reasons why the scenario that you present is somewhat unrealistic. One, it really flies in the face of what I see are the overwhelming cultural trends. But also the economic realities in that situation are such that those would be, those people who are capable of engaging in that kind of commerce would benefit from engaging in that kind of commerce. And in your question, you also collectivize California and Utah. And I don't think that's really an appropriate way to look at the situation either, because, the Dalai Lama once said, what would you do if you were president? He said, the first thing I would do is start calling things by their true names. And when you say California and Utah and sells avocados and sells potato product, you're really ignoring the fact that you're kind of collectivizing them into this, based on government border group that says that, just because they live under that government, that they're all of the same mind. The question is, would the government of California stop someone who's producing avocados in California from selling them to someone in Idaho? And it's possible. I'm not going to say guarantee here's the answer, but but the thing is, governments only provide impediments to trade. You could say governments, they got the Small Business Administration, they got whatever. There's certain little things that they do to facilitate, but in terms of governing and setting trade policy, all they do is provide restrictions and expenses. Excuse me, I'm getting over a sinus infection. It's been an intense couple of weeks on the road, so I apologize for my extra noise here, my nasally voice. But the other thing is, I'll just end with this one point. Excuse me, that I think is really important about this idea of Americanism. We don't own Americanism. It belongs to humanity as part of the heritage of humanity moving forward. It is something that some people living in the United States, have lived in opposition to their entire lives. It is it is an ideal that some people who live outside of the United States have dedicated their entire lives to. And the idea of America should not be, let's protect and preserve this thing that we've got exactly as it is. It should be, let's promote Americanism to humanity. Let's spread that. Let's make that inclusive. Let's grow that. Let's set an example. Let's show the way forward again. And this is why I say it that way, is that the American Revolution showed the way forward for humanity away, at least to a large degree, from monarchies and arbitrary central authority. But now it's become this gross centralized, or the federal government at least, has become this gross centralized institution that really now is arguably the biggest bully in the world and the most anti-American institution in the world. And with this platform, and if I may just shamelessly go back to that, when we talk about localized federal government, there are 22 million people who work for the government at all levels in the United States. Only 3 million work at the federal level. So we're really just talking about getting rid of this destructive layer of fat at the top. Some of it gets localized, but it's really what's radical about this is that when I mean radical in the best of it, getting to the root of the problem, it is that the more you centralize power, the more corrupt it gets. I'll stop. I'm so excited. I appreciate the opportunity to ramble, but man, feel free to interrupt.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. I'm loving a lot of the rambling. So, I do have a question though, because I think, to a certain extent, when you say you're talking about these arbitrary borders, I think to a certain extent that is true, but I also think to a large extent it's not as well. And let me kind of explain what I mean. So, I am personally a pretty devout Christian. And I see in my book very clear commands to, regardless of, even adultery, one of the worst sins in the book, according to the book, right, is one of those things where Jesus says, he's who's without sin, cast the first stone. And yet that ideology has been used to murder millions of people. Millions of people. I don't think that's, deniable by anybody. You have organizations like the Catholic Church, and even Westboro Baptist, I would argue, isn't quite as bad as their reputation, but they're still hateful, definitely. You know what I mean? And I think the biggest thing that I question there is those wars, even more so than abuse of the ideology, has always been a cultural divide, right? Like they speak a different language, or they worship a different god in some cases, or they have different politics. Maybe it's I see on the internet people get infuriated about the way people treat like animals in Islamic culture, for example, for things like Ed, right? And so the question kind of is the same question as the first one, only instead of trade laws and things like that with governments, do you ever worry that like big groups and like tribalism, basically, that these big groups of, hey, we stand on our atheist platform, but we stand on our Christian platform, and then they'll start fighting that way? Because at that point, it starts getting a little bit more bloody, I think, than governmental regulations, at least between the states.
Well, I'm really at that from Christian angle, and especially with that view to history, and that you pointed out Westboro versus the Crusades, right?
Right.
And I think that's an important mark of human progress. And this is where I'm a big fan of the work of statist, hardcore statist, Steven Pinker, professor at Harvard, who has proven that statistically speaking, we are in the most peaceful times in human history. You are less likely today than ever before to be subject to violence at the hands of another human being in pretty much every category. That it's like a radioactive decay or exponential reduction curve, and that progress is the mark of civilization progressing. So I don't worry about that, first of all, because I know that humanity is getting less violent over time, that markets get better over time. Markets favor, trade over violence. Always, that's just the nature of how do you create more value. That's the trend of humanity. There are a few things that I do worry about. I worry about nuclear war. I worry about someone in the super class being able to enact some kind of eugenics program or release a super bug or, something of that nature. But in terms of the general, forward trend of humanity getting more peaceful over time, I'm not worried about people suddenly, getting religion in a way that, makes them violent, because the trend is clearly, very, very clearly in that regard towards peace and mutual acceptance and respect over the course of human history, regardless of how you would analyze that academically. I think it's pretty hard to make the case, for anything else in terms of the overall trend. When you ask it to me as a serious challenge to this idea of localization, I think that the cost of having, I can't guarantee, but that this is never going to happen. Again, it's not the panacea, but I think the trend is clear that in putting down the guns and demilitarizing and switching to a militia-based defense, that should there be any significant conflict, that the cost would be a lot lower, that it would be resolved much more efficiently. I think what we've seen even in India, Pakistan recently, I know this was I think about I don't want to place it now, but a month or two ago, where there was the Indian pilot shot down. Right. In the age of the internet, the abilities of governments to spiral things out into war is harder. We used to be able to convince millions of gullible young men like myself to dress up in silly costumes and meet in the middle of a field where none of us live to kill each other because we're wearing different colors. Like it's not conceivable in the age of the internet that we could be convinced of such ridiculousness.
Well, and I would even agree with that on a governmental level. In fact, I would even say, I grew up in a very gung-ho American patriotic family, and to a certain extent, I certainly am still American and patriotic, but, the Iraq War was nonsense. But when I see groups like Antifa, for example, or ISIS, right, where it's like there's clearly still ideologies out there that want people who don't agree with them, dead, and they even seem to be rising in certain segments of the community. I think it would be interesting to note when Professor Pinkerton did his study, versus maybe now, or because it's even in the last 10 years, right? We've seen organizations. I don't think I've ever lived in a time when I feared domestic terrorism, and yet now we're talking, there's Eugene Police Department that was going to be bombed like a month ago or 2 months ago by groups of the Antifa,
It's Pinker, and this is modern work. He's got a great TED Talk on this. And like I said, I totally disagree with him on the full conclusion. He gives the government credit for this, and certainly as an institution, it's been the embodiment of a lot of positive things of human progress, like police methods of holding real violent criminals accountable. But what you see, if the worst that you can come up with is Antifa, I think we're doing okay. I've been directly, confronted by Antifa. I'm not scared of them. And again, it's a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But when you step back, and this is where Professor Pinker's work gives you a great sense of the global and historical scale of violence and how it connects to human nature and psychology, this huge overall decline. Even ISIS, and I would argue that you want to be afraid of ISIS. I would argue that ISIS is largely a government and media creation in the first place. And even if it's not, even if 9/11 and everything about the 9/11 Commission report was true, and all the government's inflated numbers are true, it doesn't change the course of this historical curve of violence declining. And it really wouldn't amount to a blip on the radar in terms of the scale of human violence and destruction. It's been largely written out of history. And that's, again, where Steven Pinker does a great job of going back and doing an appropriate survey of history and creating this composite vision that gives you this clear, decay curve.
Right. Well, and I would like to say, just as because I do kind of want to get your opinion on this. It's an idea that I first heard from Joe Rogan, but which I know, people always say to, if you get your politics from a comedian, don't expect it to be a joke. But to be fair, he is not just a comedian anymore, right? He's an interviewer. He's certainly a socialist and a statist, and I got a lot of things I disagree with him on. But
So my favorite saying about that was, I get my news from Jon Stewart on Comedy Central, and I get my comedy from Fox News. But yeah,
that's funny. Well, he said though he made the point. He was like, it's easy to look at a group like Antifa and say, yeah, I'm not that worried now because they're not that bad now. But 2 years ago, they were just protesting, and then they were hitting people with bike locks, and then they were showing up with rifles. And it's like, at this rate of progression, the logical conclusion is eventually violence, especially, the bombing thing just happened. They caught the bomb. There wasn't a Eugene police station bomb, but it was January 29th. They put bombs in the Eugene police station, right? And it's like 2 years ago, there was no Antifa going to do that. I mean, and in fact, I would argue even before the Milo riots in Berkeley, there was probably virtually no threat of domestic terrorism at all. Islamic, white nationalist, it didn't matter. I mean, we lived pretty safely, and now it seems to be like they are progressing at a very fast rate with violence.
How are people killed?
Well, but to be fair, the brown shirts didn't kill anybody in their first decade. They were just violent.
I think we live in too much of a different era. I don't think it might be the same trend. It might be, and history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I think there's a cyclical nature to a spiral of progression. There may be similar trends behind that, but even if that's the case, it's not going to be as bad as it was in the past. That much is clear. There have been other such cycles throughout history. And again, if you go back before the brown shirts, you look at the atrocities of governments prior to the modern era. They were far worse and more grotesque in scale. I mean, even with what's historically documented in Europe. So I think if there is going to be that, if that's what it is, it's not going to be that bad. But if the people who are behind this really want something significantly different, again, this is why, as a voluntarist, I say, okay, Antifa, you want your socialist commune. I want you to have the freedom to do that. Let's open up whatever land that's unclaimed for homesteading. You go claim that. You set up. You want to claim an area to start your new city, your new community, your new whatever. I support you doing that. And you know that if you're being honest, you're more likely to get that with my offer than with trying to get the entire world on your page. But if your model is good, I want you to have the chance to test it and show it. And if it works, prove to the world. I'm willing to admit that I could be wrong, and you have the right to try to prove me wrong on this point.
Right. Well, and so I think that's basically got all the rounded edges, if you will, on that. The last thing I think that I wanted to kind of ask about, and this one is, now I will freely admit something really quick that I have over my lifetime, and you actually have helped me tremendously with this. So I want to give you a little bit of credit where credit is due. I have, throughout my life, had to come out of what was a very not separation of church and state kind of ideal, right? The whole, homosexuality should be illegal and all that kind of stuff, you know what I mean? And I have now since become very libertarian on most social issues. I wouldn't say all, I'm still pro-life, but for the most part, I believe in decriminalizing drugs and things like that. My question, though...
If I may, the idea of pro-life versus pro-choice being libertarian, I think that represents a fundamental misunderstanding of libertarianism. And a lot of people don't take the time to fully apply. If I may, I'd like to share the perspective of Walter Block, Professor Walter Block, friend of mine at Loyola University in New Orleans. And his position, he calls it evictionism. And it's this, you got to know that if the Republicans and Democrats created this pro-life versus pro-choice framing, it's to take advantage of you. It's to create an artificial divide. So, you know, there are very few people who are really pro-abortion. So, how do you square as a libertarian? The mother owns herself, and the child, as an independent life, at some point also owns itself, him or herself, right? So you have to be able to have a way of approaching this that takes both of those into account. And it's not pro-life, pro-choice is really the incorrect framing, because if a mother's life is at risk, you want her to be able to have safe access to abortion, right? I mean, if it's to say, you wouldn't say, no, if even though you're both going to die, you have to just have this child, right?
Right, at least save one.
I think even the sort of, you know, the most, any reasonable person who identifies as pro-life would have to recognize that, in a sense, that's a realistic possibility. Do you want 2 people to die, or do you want 1 people to die? If you're really pro-life, then you know you have to say, well, yeah, the mother has the right to kill, to end that life, to save her own. That's her choice, that she has to be the one to make that call, right? And the same is true with this idea of evictionism, that represents or recognizes that the child owns itself, but the mother, in a sense, has a right as the host to evict it if she chooses to, of it being her body. And that at some point there's an obligation that comes into this of saying, well, if you've let me into your home, you can, and it you know, there's a blizzard outside, and if you evict me, I'm going to die. You can't just kick me out. But that same, you know, there's a standard that applies, because then you are killing someone, you are ending a life, and you can recognize all of these realities without being forced into the pro-life, pro-choice thing, and say, let's all be as pro, you know, as I mean, I don't know what you would substitute here, but let's all be as pro righteousness and legitimacy and honor and integrity as possible in this issue, and say that we can respect the rights of the child and the rights of the mother, and come to a reasonable position that supports mothers who, you know, people who don't want abortions to happen, supports them in that pregnancy and in adoption without government in the way, and all of these answers, you know, there are better ways of dealing with without getting government involved. And by setting up this, you're either pro-life or pro-choice, it's like, well, it's because you have to have a government solution. No, you don't.
Well, and so I think you actually kind of accidentally hit the question I was going to ask on the head there, which is really, you know, I do, as much as I've come out of this moralistic idea of government, I also, as somebody who lives a moralistic life, right, understand why people want that in their government. Now, without advocating that, because I understand that that is wrong, how do you maintain the basic framework of that? Because I think we generally agree the basic framework exists. Like, for example, you know, that I always use the example of um, sex with minors, because there's cultures that say 16, 17 isn't that weird. Yet we all agree that 10 is a problem, right? How do we enforce that if we don't have governments? Or at least small governments?
Yeah, no. So I'm glad you kept going with that, because that is a bigger question than the subject of abortion. And I might rephrase the question as, how does society assert that wrong is wrong? Right? How does society maintain and establish and maintain a concept and a system of justice? And those are very important questions to answer, especially when government has taken on such a psychological monopoly on these things. And the first step is to recognize that government is fundamentally a violation of those things. That taxation is theft, that war is murder, that police are essentially territorial gangs imposing the will of politicians who are criminals. And when you talk about being like pro-life or pro-choice, I want to say, of course, we're all pro-life, but for me, what guides me in this is that I'm pro-ethic. I want to say, what's the ethical way about going about this? So how does society do that? How do we create those mechanisms? And
I think I'm having a little bit of a lag here at the moment. Can you hear me, sir?
in the future.
Can you hear me, sir? All right, just one moment, friends. We're just gonna see if we can get the connection back here a minute. Just had a brief problem.
I think we're back.
All right, yep, I got you. We're good.
All right, can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sorry about that. So I was just saying that we don't need to be too creative in this. We can look to what's going on in the present, and why do you not go out and murder your neighbors or your other people the road every time they make. It's not because
Shoot.
internet and that kind of how we do. All right. I don't know. I don't know if it's my service or my end or yours, but we'll see if we can get through this. You got me now?
Yeah, I do got you now. Let's try and maybe just sit here and I don't know BS for a little bit. See if it picks up the BS. See, I can see it. I'm pretty sure it's probably my connection because it just got real windy over here. Let me see if I can get this a little bit closer. Maybe it'll work better. Well, I wanted to apologize to you guys, everybody who was watching. If Mr. Kokesh, you can hear me, I want to apologize for that as well. I'm not sure which end it is, but I'm gonna go ahead and take accountability for it anyway. As soon as I can hear audio again, I guess we will try and continue, or if we can, shoot. You would think in 2019 the wireless connection would be better than this. Now, while we're sitting here in this little interim period, I guess you could call it. I do want to briefly point out something. Basically that I've been.
Yeah.
All right, I did just hear some audio. Yes, I did just hear some audio.
Can you hear me now?
All right, and the screen is moving. And I think we're back. Are we back?
All right. Well, it says poor connection, but if you can hear me.
Yeah, mine's saying poor connection too, but I can definitely hear you. The poor connection seems to only manifest in video, but sorry about that.
All right, well, I'll try to wrap this up because this is an important point to make. Again, one of the most important libertarian answers to a lot of the questions about how's it going to be like this? How are we going to do this? Is I don't know. I'm not a central planner. All I can tell you is I'm not going to force my ideas on you, and I'm not going to support anybody else forcing their ideas on you. And that we're going to allow people to come together coercively, and we're going to tap the collective wisdom as much as those market principles and market conditions will allow to get the best answers to all these questions. But what I can tell you is how we get to the point where we can make this transition happen. And it's, again, through localizing government. You get government down to the state level, down to the county level, down to the community and city level. At very least, you're going to see law enforcement immediately customized to the needs of those communities and the desires of the people who live there, not some central authority, not their neighbors, not the majority population in the rest of the state or the rest of the country whose decision gets forced upon them. And that's what's going to give us the flexibility to customize those institutions and eventually transition them to either voluntary institutions themselves or displace them with voluntary institutions. So, like for example, well, and a lot of it's just getting obsolete. About half of interactions with law enforcement in the United States can't pull
Right.
people over if they're not driving their cars because we have all self-driving cars. The rate of murder going down, the accountability through the internet for some of the other crimes, the ability to discourage financial crime with better accountability, the efficiency of private systems coming up. Eventually, what we think of as law enforcement today as the public safety functions and accountability for criminals as police are going to become very small naturally, as we free up a lot of these market functions, as these technologies develop, and this is not stuff that like is new to me or new from me in any way. This is pretty widely accepted that, we're on the verge of some major technological leap over the next 5 to 10 years. Self-driving cars are already here. It's just a matter of how soon can we implement them. And if anything, I think government slows that down. 40,000 people die every year on government roads. It'd be a lot less if they were, a community-controlled, more private-based, and determined by market forces that are going to, put in the incentives to make them safer. So, similarly, law enforcement, it gets more flexible, and we'll see where it goes on community by community basis.
And thank you for that. I want to wrap this interview up with something that I think we probably actually agree on. In fact, to be clear, I do want to just point out we probably agree on like 75% of everything, to be honest. So this interview is obviously maybe even more than that. This interview is obviously meant to be slightly contrarian, but I just want people to know I do greatly support the work you do, Mr. Kokesh. I am actually strongly what would be the word? Contemplating voting for you. I can't stand Trump, and I loathe everybody on the Democratic side as well. So, but there's just obviously the questions that I like to ask, get political discourse going, and all that kind of stuff. But I do want to wrap this up.
TJ, if I'm
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. The most important thing is to get involved with the Libertarian Party, because I want obviously you're not a Republican, you're not
right.
in terms of like the people who represent the Republican Party, at the national level. And the Libertarian Party is at a point right now where we're going from being an ideology party to a coalition party, and we need to be inclusive of people like you. And I would hope that my campaign gives you an opportunity and a motivation to be involved with the Libertarian Party to help me win the nomination. Even if you don't vote for me, to say, hey, let's get someone who's going to, really bring an interesting message, who's really going to challenge the thinking of the two-party system fundamentally. Let's get Adam Kokesh to be the nominee of the LP in 2020. Start showing up at your local meetings. There's a bunch of state conventions coming up in the next few weeks that I'm looking at going to myself personally. So anything that you can do to get involved, to set yourself up to be a delegate next year. There are no primaries in the Libertarian Party. The nominee is completely decided by the 1,000 or so people who decide to show up as delegates at the national convention. And if you went to your state convention before, that's really usually all it takes. Fill out a couple forms. There's a few other little hoops in some states, but it's really easy to get involved and have a big voice, in a party that's growing faster than any other in the United States right now.
I'd certainly agree, and I'd even say, I think if we could manage to get you the Libertarian nomination and Jesse Ventura the Green Party nomination, and get both of those parties at least 1 million votes, I think it would do a lot for political discourse. Whether
Absolutely.
or not, yeah, exactly right. And it's regardless of whether or not people agree with Green Party ideals or Libertarian Party, not the point. It's just to get the discourse going. I think would be great. And I wanted to end this on something that I think we would probably agree on. So, and I'm not entirely sure because I've never heard too much talking about it, but I know that you've been a frequent, I guess, guest on Alex Jones' show in the past and Ron Paul and stuff like that. Do you ever fear the growing trend of nations towards globalism? Because one of the things that I think is most threatening that governments are doing now is they get together in these big world councils of churches and these United Nations and these national Atlantic Treaty organizations and things like that. Are we going too far with this globalization, and is that something that you think could manifest in proportions that maybe are unforeseen in their negativity, shall we say? Ah, shoot. Got a poor connection again. I'm sorry, friends. That was, man. Can you hear me now? No, I don't think so. I'm sorry. All right, so I just want to take this one portion just to note real quick. This will be fixed by tomorrow. I can promise you guys that. All right, can you hear me? Man.
I just missed the question. Go ahead. It looks clear now.
All right. So basically, the question was, we're seeing rises in whether it's religious with the WCC, or national with the UN, or in trade with the WTO, or even in health with the WHO. There seems to be a glowing trend of not just centralization, but centralization globally. And that personally terrifies me. What is your opinion on that?
I think there has been a trend towards centralization with technology of certain kinds, like mass media and print, over the last, last century or so, give or take, maybe less than a century. There have been some very disturbing trends of centralization. But I think, and in some ways, those trends have a lot of momentum and continue in certain ways, as you point out. But I think we've passed the high watermark of that. I think we've passed the high watermark of government as a whole. And what we see now is a beautiful trend toward decentralization with Brexit, with the Scottish independent vote, with Catalonia, with all the various independent movements in the United States. You have the state of Jefferson in California, the 51st State Project in Colorado, Vermont, New Hampshire, Texas, California that wants to split off as its own state, or possibly become as many as 6 different states. Hawaii, Alaska, a lot of states in the United States have had distinct independence movements throughout the world. I think there's a general trend of just like, hey, it's the age of the internet. If we hold a vote and we say we don't want to be a part of your big club anymore, are you really going to send police to stop us? And the answer in Catalonia was yes, they're going to send police to stop you. But I don't think they can get away with suppressing those movements the same way that they used to be able to in the past. And I think that growing sentiment is going to be the dominant trend of political reorganization. And some of it's going to be, sort of ethno-nationalists breaking away. And it's going to be, difficult at times. There's going to be a lot of challenge. It's going to look good. It's going to look bad. There are going to be some negative short-term consequences. But I think pretty quickly, the overall long-term positive consequences of decentralization of power are going to become obvious pretty quickly. So I'm actually pretty excited about that. I think it's an exciting time to be alive.
Well, and I certainly hope to see that. That would actually be pretty cool. And I will say this much too. If I would prefer to be wrong than right on the things that we disagree on. You know what I mean? That would be a better society, most definitely. So, with that, I think that wraps up. We're about an hour and 2 minutes at the moment. So I think that's about everything we got here. Just out of curiosity, would you ever be willing to come on again when we possibly have a better internet connection?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do an update sometime early next spring as we're getting into the next Libertarian Party convention season.
Yeah, definitely. Let's do it. I'm down.
All right.
You have a good rest of your day, sir, and thank you very much for being here.
Happy to help.
All right, so that was here with Adam Kokesh on the Watchdog. Those of you who were watching this live, you did not see anything, but we are going to be posting this video later on tonight with the full Skype interview. You'll be able to see Mr. Kokesh's lovely mug as well as my own. And yeah, so that was the interview there. As you can see, right, you certainly get a general idea of what Mr. Kokesh is about as far as his presidential campaign is concerned, or as I've seen him put it, actually. I should have brought this up on, during the interview. He's running for not president, as he would say sometimes on his Twitter. But, and I do want to stress, despite a lot of the things that I know we disagree on, I think we got good talk about that during this interview, that there is still the idea of generally Mr. Kokesh is on the side of freedom. Generally, the Watchdog is on the side of freedom. And I do think sometimes we need to speak in generalities. When you are fighting for the freedom of humanity, the freedom to worship what God you want, the freedom to speak what you'd like to speak, the freedom to own the firearms you'd like to own, you know, I think that it is good for us to have a big tent per se, right? Even including folks who are even, you know, even large statists like Jesse Ventura and Joe Rogan, people who I think are, you know, they're pretty much socialist. They're still wanting to push forward towards freedom. They're still not willing to sacrifice freedom for their ideals, and I think that we need to be willing to have a big tent in that regard. So we're going to have this video up on YouTube. It'll be our first Watchdog that we're posting up on YouTube. We're going to have the full interview posted for you here on the Facebook page a little bit later. We'll be sending it also to Mr. Kokesh, and he can do with it what he wishes. And you guys have been, of course, an awesome viewing base as always. Go ahead and like, share, and like the page if you are interested in our content. And you can also like us at the ACP Official at Gab, Terrestrial Earthbird, parentheses, TheCynicogue on Twitter, and TheCynicogue on YouTube, where this video will be posted. Questions, comments, concerns, critiques, anything like that, down below, perfectly welcome. We advocate free dialogue. And you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks for watching.